January 28, 1986. The world was watching. Millions of people across America turned on their television that morning. Families gathered around in living rooms. Workers paused in offices. For a brief moment, the entire country was looking in the same direction. A spacecraft stood on a launch pad at Kennedy Space Center. At 11:38 in the morning, Challenger lifted off.
And liftoff of
The engines roared. The shuttle rose into the sky. The crowd cheered. The cameras followed. 73 seconds after launch, the impossible happened. The spacecraft broke apart. The voices on television went silent. The celebration became confusion. The cheering became disbelief. 7 people disappeared in front of the entire world.
We mourn 7 heroes. Michael Smith,
The pilot, known for his calm confidence.
Dick Scobie,
The commander, a veteran astronaut who had already flown into space.
Judith Resnick,
An engineer, scientist, and one of NASA's most accomplished astronauts.
Ronald McNair,
A physicist who had overcome racial barriers to become one of the Americans' most respected astronauts.
Ellison Onizuka,
The first Asian American to travel into space.
Gregory Jarvis,
A payload specialist.
and Krista Mikaloff.
A teacher from New Hampshire. She had been handpicked by President Reagan from among 142 applicants. The teacher in the space program was a presidential initiative. She planned to teach lessons from orbit. Millions of students planned to watch. The Challenger disaster became one of the most shocking moments in the modern history.
Good morning. This is Krista McAuliffe, live from the Challenger.
But the most disturbing part was not what happened in the sky. It was what happened before the launch. Because Challenger was not destroyed by something nobody understood. The warning signs existed. People saw them. People talked about them. People raised concerns. And somehow, the launch still happened. Which raised a troubling question. How does a disaster happen when the danger is already known? How do people move forward when the evidence is telling them to stop? Hi. This is Motive Bureau, where we uncover the psychology behind history's most significant events. Let's begin. The Challenger tragedy is often remembered as a technical failure, a broken part, a mechanical mistake, but that explanation creates a much bigger mystery. Because machines do not decide when to launch, people do. Somewhere before the cold January morning, managers looked at the same information and reached a decision. This is an acceptable risk. But why? Inside NASA and its contractor companies, there was already a growing concern. It was about one small component, a small-looking rubber seal called an O-ring. The O-ring was part of the Shuttle solid rocket booster. The 2 large white rockets attached to the sides of the external tank were called solid rocket boosters. They provided most of the power needed to lift the shuttle during the first 2 minutes. After using their fuel, they separated from the shuttle and descended into the ocean by parachute. The O-ring job was important. During launch, enormous pressure and heat would try to escape through the joints of the booster. The O-ring was supposed to create a seal, but engineers had noticed something troubling. In previous launches, the O-ring showed signs of damage, a phenomenon called erosion. The seal was burning. The O-ring was considered a replaceable component. And after each launch, they were typically inspected and replaced if necessary. However, the main problem was not that a specific O-ring was defective. Rather, the design of the joint was such that even a properly functioning O-ring could fail to seal quickly and effectively under certain conditions, especially in extremely cold temperatures. The engineers at Morton Thiokol were not discovering the O-ring problem for the first time. The warning had been building for years, but the human mind slowly adapts to repeated exposure. A risk that feels terrifying once can become normal after being seen many times. A pilot who experiences turbulence on every flight doesn't panic every time. The O-ring problem was becoming something worse than a technical issue. It was becoming familiar, and familiar dangers are often the ones people underestimate.
It's a kind of Russian roulette. You got away with it, It was a risk, you got away with it, but it shouldn't be done over and over again like that. And
The human brain doesn't just assess risk based on actual probability. It judges it based on past experiences. If you do something dangerous 10 times and nothing happens, the brain starts to create a story, so it's probably not that dangerous. According to Ivan Pavlov's theory of habituation, living organisms reduce their initial response when they are repeatedly exposed to the same stimulus. In other words, when a dangerous event occurs repeatedly without causing serious consequences, the mind gradually reduces its warning response, and the danger begins to feel less threatening over time. We see this pattern everywhere. A driver doesn't always wear a seatbelt because nothing has happened yet. The risk isn't eliminated, only the perception of the risk is diminished. And once danger transfers into normality, the question is no longer do we know there's a problem? The question became how we became comfortable enough with the problem that we no longer feel the need to solve it. But Challenger has another layer. Because some people did not ignore the danger, some people tried to stop the launch. Inside the engineering teams responsible for the boosters, people were paying attention. One of those people was Roger Boyajoli. He had spent years working on the technology that made human spaceflight possible. And what happened to the warnings reveals an even darker mechanism. In the weeks before Challenger launch, engineers became increasingly concerned about the temperature conditions. The launch was scheduled for the January 28th. Florida was experiencing unusually cold weather. Temperatures were expected to drop far below what engineers considered safe. The concern was simple. The O-rings depended on flexibility. In cold temperature, the rubber could become less responsive. If the seal could not properly expand and close the gap during ignition, hot gases could escape. And during a shuttle launch, escaping gases were not a small problem. On the night of January 27, 1986, engineers and managers from Morton Thiokol gathered in Utah to discuss a critical problem. They first held an internal meeting where engineers revealed the data and raised their concerns. The engineers recommended that Challenger should not launch if the O-ring temperature was below 53 degrees of Fahrenheit or 11.7 degrees of Celsius. But 53 degrees of Fahrenheit was not a proven safe limit. It was simply the coldest temperature at which a shuttle had previously launched, and even that flight had shown serious O-ring damage. On the morning of the disaster, the air temperature was only 36 degrees of Fahrenheit, while parts of the booster joints may have been as cold as 28 degrees due to the cold temperatures overnight. After that internal discussion, a teleconference has held between Morton Thiokol, NASA Marshall Space Flight Center, and the Kennedy Space Center. During the call, Morton Thiokol presented its technical concerns. NASA officials questioned the possibility of delaying the launch. The discussion shifted from engineering risk to whether the evidence was strong enough to justify stopping the mission. The question was no longer is there a risk? Everyone knew there was. The question became is the risk acceptable? And that difference was enormous. Because once the discussion moved from should we do this to how much danger can we tolerate, the decision has already started moving into one direction. After the teleconference, Morton Thiokol's managers asked for a meeting. This moment was critical. The engineers repeated their recommendation. Do not launch.
Twice them down in the table in front of the managers and literally screaming at the managers to look at the photos and not ignore what they were telling us. I was told later on by
They
my colleagues
believed the risk was too high. But after further discussion among management, Morton Thiokol executives reversed the engineers' recommendation. The company changed its official position. The launch was approved, and the countdown continued. So why can a person hear a serious warning, understand it, and still choose a path that creates the greatest risk? In the 1950s, Festinger developed the theory of cognitive dissonance. The idea was simple: when the human hold two conflicting beliefs at the same time, it creates a psychological discomfort. The brain doesn't like contradiction, so it tries to reduce that discomfort, sometimes by changing the situation, but sometimes by changing the way we see the situation. On one side, the engineers, the people who understood the booster, the people who had spent years studying the data. On the other side, managers, the people responsible for schedules, commitments, and making the mission happen. Imagine the conflict inside NASA. Belief number one: we are professionals, we are responsible for human lives. Belief number two: the mission may not be safe enough to continue. Those two ideas create a painful contradiction. Because if the second belief is true, then different questions follow. Why did we continue previous missions? Why did we accept earlier warnings? Why have we invested so much into this mission? The mind searches for relief, and sometimes the easiest solution is not we need to stop. Sometimes it becomes maybe the risk is not as serious as we thought. It happens everywhere. A trader keeps losing money. The data says leave, but leaving means that might think I was wrong. So the mind creates another explanation. The recovery is coming. Humans are not only trying to find the truth. Sometimes they are trying to protect themselves from painful truth. Eventually, the engineer's recommendation was not accepted. The launch was approved. And the next morning, Challenger lifted off. The rest of the world saw only the final 73 seconds. But the real disaster had started much earlier. Inside meetings, inside conversations. This still leaves an even bigger question. Cognitive dissonance explains why people might convince themselves that the risk is smaller, but it doesn't fully explain something else. There were people in the room who still believed the launch was dangerous. They had the evidence. So why didn't they stop it?
I was wondering if I'd have the courage, I remember that distinctly, to stand up and say no. However, we were not asked as the engineering people. It was a management decision at the vice president's level.
What happens when the person with the truth is not a person with the power? The next mystery of Challenger is about human hierarchy. Because sometimes people do not ignore the truth because they cannot see it. They ignore it because someone more powerful tells them to look somewhere else. Decades before Challenger, one psychologist discovered something terrifying. Give someone enough authority, and many will continue doing things they personally believe are wrong. His name was Stanley Milgram, and his experiment would reveal something uncomfortable about all of us. I have provided more detailed explanation about Milgram's experiment in the Jonestown video. You can watch it after this video. In the Challenger decision-making meeting, not everyone had the same power. A senior manager's opinion usually carried more weight than a junior engineer's, even if the engineer had more accurate information. The human brain naturally trusts people with status more. We subconsciously assume if he is in the position, he probably knows more. But status doesn't always equal knowledge. This is a pattern seen everywhere. A doctor who accepts a famous professor's opinion without question. NASA was not just an organization, it was a symbol. The space program represented American innovation, scientific achievement, national pride. After years of declining public attention and the budget pressure, every launch represented success. Every delay represented failure. They had already postponed the launch. A delay meant headlines, political pressure, losing momentum. The launch had already been announced. The media was waiting. NASA had promised a schedule. The president was watching. Thousands of people were involved. Stopping meant admitting something uncomfortable. That after years of planning, millions of dollars, and countless hours of work, the mission was not ready. And this is where Challenger reveals the next layer of the human mind. The moment a mission becomes part of a group's identity, criticism begins to feeling like betrayal.
Any voice that might challenge the official NASA ideology that it could accomplish anything as it roared ahead towards 24 flights a year would be interpreted as the voice of disloyalty.
Inside organizations, this creates a dangerous situation. The person who raises concerns can become the problem, not the problem itself. And once that happens, people learn something. Speaking the truth has a social cost. This is one of the hidden dangers inside large organizations. The problem is not simply that people lacked courage. The problem is that organizations create social environments, and humans are extremely sensitive to those environments. The engineer who speaks up is not only thinking about the technical problem, they are also thinking about the social consequences. Will people respect me? Will they think I am difficult? Will I damage my career? Will I become the person who stopped the mission? And sometimes people stay silent because they know speaking has a cost. Psychologist Solomon Asch demonstrated this in his famous conformity experiments. In the 1950s, Asch placed each participant in a group where everyone else was secretly working with the experimenter and had been instructed to give the wrong answer. The task was simple: compare the lengths of lines. The correct answer was obvious, but when the entire group gave the wrong answer, many participants changed their own answer. They were not blind. They could see the correct answer, but disagreeing with the group created a psychological pressure, because humans have always faced a hidden trait: being separated from the group. For most of human history, belonging was survival. Being rejected by the group could mean losing protection, resources, and status. So the human brain developed a powerful instinct: stay connected, avoid unnecessary conflict, do not stand alone. The danger is not that people cannot see the problem, the danger is that they calculate the cost of speaking. The next layer of Challenger takes us to the moment when the final decision was made, inside a private meeting room at Morton Thiokol, after the teleconference with NASA. At the beginning of the meeting, not everyone agreed. Some managers were still concerned, but one of them strongly supported moving forward with the launch, and slowly the group began moving in the same direction. The final decision was no longer a decision that each person might have made alone. It had become a group decision, and group decisions follow psychological rules of their own. So why do people sometimes accept more risk when they are making decisions together? In the 1960s, James Stoner discovered a surprising pattern in human decision-making. He called it risk shift. Stoner asked participants to make decisions about different situations involving risk. First, people made decisions individually. Then they discussed the same problem as a group. The results were surprising. After group discussion, people often choose options that involve greater risk. The group didn't simply combine individual opinions. It changed the way people perceived the risk itself. Why does this happen? Psychologists suggested several reasons. When responsibility is shared among several people, each individual feels less personally responsible for the outcome. A person may think, if the decision is wrong, it was not only my choice. Another person may think, other experienced people are accepting this risk, so maybe the danger is not as serious as it seems. And another may think, if we delay, we might create another problem. But inside a group, risk can become easier to accept, because when responsibility is shared, confidence can grow faster than caution. And sometimes, a decision that feels acceptable to everyone in the room can become a disaster waiting outside the door. Research has shown that when the jury members discuss a case before reaching a decision, their initial positions may become more extreme. One of the well-known studies in this area was conducted by Stuart Penrose and Ray Hazzett, who examined the decision-making process of juries. Their findings suggested that group interaction can reinforce individuals' initial opinions and influence the severity of the final decision. The next layer of Challenger reveals something even more unsettling. By the time Challenger was preparing for launch, NASA was not an inexperienced organization. They had launched many rockets before. They had taken humans into orbit and brought them home safely. Every successful mission added another layer of confidence. Every safe return reinforced the belief, we understand this machine. But success creates a dangerous question. What happens when confidence slowly becomes certainty? The O-ring problem has appeared before. There had been erosion. There had been warnings. But previous missions had survived. The shuttle launched. The astronauts returned. The world celebrated. And every success sent a hidden message. Maybe we can handle it this time too. The organization was not ignoring reality. It was interpreting reality through the lens of previous victories. The past became evidence for the future. But the future doesn't always respect the past. When engineers looked at the Challenger launch conditions, they were dealing with uncertainty, cold temperatures, a vulnerable sealing system, a system that had not been fully tested under those exact circumstances. Organizations often struggle with uncertainty, especially organizations that are at the forefront. But uncertainty is uncomfortable. Humans prefer a world where outcomes feel predictable. And sometimes, when we cannot control a situation, we convince ourselves that we can. Why does a history of success sometimes make people less cautious instead of more cautious? Psychologist Ellen Langer introduced the concept of illusion of control. In 1975, Langer conducted a series of experiments exploring how people perceive control over uncertain situations. In the one famous experiment involving lottery-like situation, she found that people behave differently when they felt they had personal involvement in the outcome. For example, people who choose their own lottery numbers often valued their tickets more highly than people who received random numbers. The actual probability did not change. The outcome was still based on chance, but the feeling of control changed the way people thought. The human brain has a strong desire to believe, I understand this, I can predict this, I can manage this, because uncertainty creates anxiety. Feeling in control reduces that anxiety, even when the feeling of control is not completely real. This happens in everyday life. A driver has taken risks hundreds of times without an accident. They start believing, I am a safe driver. A trader who after a few successes thinks he controls the market. NASA was one of the most advanced scientific organizations in the world, but too much experience can create a psychological danger. The feeling that because we are experts, we have complete control. Now let's take a closer look at exactly how the disaster happened. Shortly after ignition, pressure inside the right solid rocket booster caused its aft field joint to flex and open slightly. Because of the unusual low temperature, the O-ring had become less resilient and failed to seal the joint quickly enough. Hot pressurized gases escaped through the opening and eroded the seal. The leak was likely blocked temporarily by combustion debris, but at about 59 seconds after launch, a flame reappeared and began burning against the external tank. At around 72 seconds, the lower attachment of the right booster failed, allowing it to rotate and strike the tank. Moments later, the hydrogen and oxygen tank structure collapsed, creating a massive fireball. At around 73 seconds, Challenger was exposed to extreme aerodynamic forces and broke apart. Therefore, the Challenger disaster was not a simple explosion, but a rapid chain of a technical and structural failure that began when the joint opened and the cold hardened O-rings failed to seal it.
Their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
And the important question is, what would we do if we were in the same position? The next time we face a problem, will we recognize it, or will we slowly become comfortable with it? The next time evidence challenges our beliefs, will we accept that we might be wrong? Or will we protect the story we have created about ourselves? The next time someone with authority tells us something, will we evaluate the evidence? The next time we see a problem in a group, will we speak? Or will we calculate the cost of being the person who disagrees? The next time we make a decision with others, will the group help us think better? Or will it make us more confident than we should be? And finally, the next time we feel completely in control, will we ask ourselves, do we actually understand this situation? Or do we simply feel comfortable because we have succeeded before? History tells you what happened. Psychology tells you why.